My name is Miloš Bošković, and today I will be talking about a startup called Truedash and AngularJs framework which Truedash is built on. So basically, Truedash is a simple and collaborative business intelligence tool, and it's a web app which basically enables your business. It's aimed at businesses, and it enables your business to have a better insight into the way it's performing. So basically, Truedash can connect to your web application, to your data source, whether it's just a database, pull your data into the Truedash, and it can visualize that data in different ways, in form of charts, tables, and some other forms as well. The startup actually is located in London. It was founded by two guys from England, and in the Shoreditch area. But we can say that actually we're working worldwide because most of us are working remotely. For example, I'm working from the city of Niš in Serbia. Two of my colleagues here in the audience are working from Belgrade. We have some people working from Russia, from the States, and these two guys, of course, they are in London. The startup has started around December 2013, and right now we have around 15 people involved in the project. Some of them are working full-time, some of them are working part-time. We also have some freelancers. The backend part, which is not important for this presentation, is built on Java Apache Spark with MongoDB. So if I said something wrong, I'm sorry, because I'm not familiar with that part too much. And front-end is built on Angular 1.x, and this X is because the versions are changing, and we're trying to follow that as much as we can. Okay, so let's check out what the application looks like. So this is one of the main screens in the application. In the top part of the screen, you can see the black header and the white header, which actually has a list of all the dashboards available. These dashboards can be created, modified, removed, and each of the dashboards can have a various number of so-called cards. These cards are actually the visualizations of your data flows from your database or from your businesses. And they can be moved around, they can be dragged, resized, and so on. You can also share the cards, you can share the dashboards, and hence the collaborative part in the name of the whole application. Each of the cards can have one or more data flows, and we call these metrics. So basically, you can also add these metrics and remove them. Here we have examples of, as you can see, lines, bars, pies. There's also a map of the United Kingdom with some statistics. We have tables which can be sorted and so on. This here is a full screen view or so-called explore mode of a single card. And here you can just get a little bit more details of a single card. You can also add notifications, actually create alerts, which enable you to get some sort of notifications if something happens with these metrics here. So for example, you have sales shown in your cards, and you want a notification if sales have dropped by 10% in the last 24 hours. And you're going to get that notification as just plain notification on your, in the website here, or as an email. Also, as I said, cards can be custom made, and this part of the application is we call the card builder. And here you can create cards, you can add metrics, you can remove metrics. You can also apply different visual styles to them, decide how they're going to be rendered. You can choose the frequency of the data being displayed. So for example, you want to show the data on daily basis, or maybe a weekly basis, monthly basis, and so on. You can also, of course, change the date range of the metrics. Right now we're working on compare option, where you will be able to have two identical metrics from the different date ranges, so that you can see, for example, how your product sales is going, in different parts of the year, over the year. And also there's different ways of, different functions that you can apply to metrics, and these are actually the tabs that you're seeing in the menu. These are filters, groupings, and formulas, so you can also play around with the metrics. So for example, you want to split all the values by 3, divide by 3, and you can get that very easily. This is what Truedash looks like on different platforms. Here is iPad. It's also responsive, but we're building a separate mobile application at the moment. So that is in process at the moment, and it's going to be out soon. But you can also, of course, run the web application right now in your on your mobile. So what we're going to cover in the rest of this presentation, first we're going to go over some of AngularJs features just to understand what it offers. Then we are going to talk about how we are using these features in Truedash and how we are not using them. In other words, how we try to avoid some potential pitfalls or some other issues that we run into and then later we manage to solve. So first of all, can you raise your hands if you're working with Angular so that I can have some idea? Okay, great. So Angular is a superheroic JavaScript MVW framework, and hence the title of this talk, Taming the Superhero. This line is actually taken from their site, so that's how they decided to name Angular. And I think that recently they removed this title. It's no longer there, but it used to be there. And probably most of us know here what MVC stands for as a design pattern. But do you happen to know what MVW stands for? Whatever, exactly. So that means that this third component of the design pattern can be either a controller or whatever works for you. That's how they like to say. It's maintained by Google, and it was created in Google as well. And these guys who were creating AngularJS, initially they didn't have in mind creating a full-blown framework for the front end. What they wanted is just some sort of a tool for designers so they could easily and quickly come up with some sort of mock-up working HTML. But later on, it turned out to be something completely different. And I'm pretty much happy about it, yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the features. So first, one of the most important features here, which the whole Angular and other directives and everything that we're going to be talking about relies on, are bindings. And bindings are basically an implementation of observer pattern. So what Angular can do here for you in this HTML code, for example, it can take any of the parameters from JavaScript, like variables or functions, it can evaluate them, and as they are changing throughout your application, it's gonna act right away and update your HTML. So no need for you to do anything with jQuery and update the code because some variable has changed. Angular is gonna do that for you right away. And in this particular example, we have an input box on the right, and you have also a heading underneath it. So as you're typing in the input box, the heading is updating right away. And this code that you see, the HTML code, is everything you need to get this example working. You're just typing and you're getting heading updated as you're doing that. There are three different types of bindings. You have one-way binding, two-way binding, and one-time binding. This is an example of two-way binding, and it's two-way because you have an input box which is connected to heading. But mostly we are using, in our application, generally a one-way binding is used most of the times. And basically that means that you can just have some HTML code which is going to depend on some function, as I said, or parameter, not input box. And then it's going to render and act based on the decisions that you have defined or actions that you have defined there. And also we're going to talk a little bit about one-time binding a little bit later. Now, one thing that I found interesting here is that this two-way data binding, and it used to be put forward as one of the main features in Angular, and they were always putting these examples here. By the way, this is an example from their site, I believe. And there were strong discussions on internet about two-way data binding. And just recently, a couple of weeks ago, Miško Hevery, one of the founders of AngularJS, one of the guys who created it, he was talking on this. He was giving a talk about Angular 2.0, the new upcoming Angular. And he mentioned that two-way data binding is an anti-pattern for large-scale applications. And I found that amusing because it used to be the main feature, and now all of a sudden, okay, not all of a sudden, but after a couple of years, it has become an anti-pattern. And I find that interesting, but on the other hand, it's kind of okay for me because that's how a certain tool evolves, it changes, it leaves some features behind, and it adopts some new concepts, which is pretty okay with me. And anyway, we're not using two-way data binding at all in Truedash, I believe. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about directives. Also very important concept in AngularJS world. So a directive teaches HTML new tricks. That's how people like to describe it from the AngularJS world. So basically we're able to define new behavior on existing HTML tags that you have, or some new ones. And this is, if you think about it, it's nothing new because you can do this with jQuery as well. But directives enable you to do this in a much more elegant fashion, and the code is definitely going to look better, and it's just going to feel better generally. Directives can be defined as HTML tags or attributes, and here you have these two examples with a tag and attribute. custom attribute. However, you can also define them using classes, or just regular HTML classes, or even comments. But these two are basically not used at all, and mostly because they were just meant to be used in old browsers who find it difficult to realize that you have custom attributes or custom tags like you have here. Angular itself has a set of directives of its own, which are integral part to the framework, and they are usually directives are prefixed with something, and in Angular, in case of Angular, they are prefixed with ng. So if you're making your own application, you can maybe prefix them with something else, with the name of your application, or maybe you can take some other prefix that you feel like is good for you, that's going to work for you. In our particular situation, we are using TU. And now when you think about it, our web app is called Truedash, so it would make more sense to use TD. So another question for you, why not TD? Yeah, you already have TD element. And if you even try to do td-date-picker, that won't work. And while we're here, just small off-topic question, do you know what TD stands for? We know TH, right? Sorry?
Table data.
Exactly, table data. Well, I didn't know up to yesterday, so I needed to look it up just to make sure. Okay, so let's move to two examples, two very nice directives from Angular. So here we have ngIf and ngShow. And these code snippets represent these two directives, of course. So what they basically do, okay, let me first explain the example. So you have a checkbox, and if you check it, you're going to get the span shown. If you uncheck it, the span is going to be removed. And the code is pretty much the same, except that ngIf and ngShow are just a little bit different. ngIf is going to render the span tag, and it's going to remove it if it's unchecked from the DOM, remove it completely. While ngShow is just going to be using CSS attribute display none and display block. So it's a pretty small difference. And if we're talking about just a regular or small applications, or maybe you're just playing around with Angular, you want to see how it's working, it really doesn't matter whether you're going to use ngIf or ngShow. There is a difference, but it really doesn't matter that much. But if you're talking about large-scale applications, then there is a huge difference between these two. So let's see how it worked or didn't work for us. So this is the same slide like the previous from the beginning of the presentation. Here you have three different dashboards. So initially, we started off with using ngIfs for changing the dashboards. So whenever you click a new dashboard, ngIf comes into place. Of course, Angular is doing all of that. It's going to change a parameter. The whole dashboard is going to be removed from the DOM, and you're going to get a new dashboard rendered from scratch, which sounds pretty much OK. But here you have a bunch of charts, and all of them are, by the way, built on D3.js library, very cool library for visualization. And you have a lot of SVG elements, which can be a little bit tricky for rendering because it's just CPU consuming. So what we ended up with is if we had like two dashboards, and each of them had around 10 cards like this, if you wanted to switch from one dashboard to another dashboard, it would take 2 or 3 seconds for browser to render everything from scratch. So the whole browser is frozen for 3 seconds. Nothing's happening. There's nothing you can do. And it was, of course, it was a serious issue for us, and it was unacceptable. So we had to find another solution, and this other solution was ngShow, of course. And another approach with ngShow, how it's going to work. Well, first of all, initially, of course, the dashboard is going to render it. It is going to be rendered. That needs to be done. And then if you move to another dashboard, that one is rendered as well. And if you go back to the first one, then the first one is just shown, because initially it was hidden. So these dashboards are now going to be shown and hidden, and in that way you're saving all of this HTML content into the DOM, and you don't need to render it all the way from the beginning. Of course, this also has some of its bad sides as well. So in this case, you have a lot of HTML elements in your DOM, and they're just taking up space even if they're not visible, right? And on top of that if you remember the binding stuff, right? All of these cards are connected to some values from JavaScript. So even when the dashboard is not shown, everything is being evaluated, updated, changed. It's being changed, which basically, it doesn't make too much sense to update something which you're not seeing. But anyway, in the end, we decided to stick with ngShow because we are saving CPU cycles, but on the other side, we're taking memory because all of these DOM is stored in the memory. And we use some additional directives to disable all of the bindings that are active in the dashboard, which is not visible. So we are just temporarily disabling them, so they're not working while we are not seeing the dashboard. And then when it comes, again, to being visible, then they're going to start working again, everything is going to update if there were some changes, and so on. So this turned out to work pretty well for us, and I'm not going to go into details how we did this because I don't have enough time, but feel free to ask questions after that and after the presentation, and we can talk about it. Okay, another very useful directive here, ngrepeat, used very widely in different applications and everywhere. So in our, first of all, ngrepeat is basically a for each or for loop. And usually it's used for rendering tables or maybe unordered lists. In our particular situation here in code snippet 1, we're using it for rendering all of the cards that you have just seen in the dashboard. So we just fetch the cards as an array, we render them in the dashboard, and that's pretty much it here. So if you want to render just a regular table with 10 rows, what's going to happen is you're going to get these 10 rows, and Angular is going to attach so-called actually watchers, which is an implementation of bindings. I didn't mention that. So it's going to attach 10 watchers to each one of the rows, so that whenever any of the values change, the table is going to update it right away accordingly, which is actually pretty cool, right? You don't need to think about updating the HTML. However, if you try to think about rendering 1,000 rows for some reason, well, that's going to work as well. But the question is how fast it's going to work. And actually, it turns out that it's going to be too CPU consuming, and it's going to be a serious issue for the performance in your browser. So the first thing that you need to do, pretty obviously, is implement pagination, and in that way, you get rid of all of the rows that you don't maybe need to render at that particular moment. But there's another way to deal with this potential issue, and that's how we dealt with when we needed to render header for the table. When you have a card which is just rendering the table, and you need to render the headers, or the columns, actually, the name of the columns. So we knew that the name of the columns are not going to be changed throughout the user session, right? So while the user is logged in, it's definitely, tables are not going to be changed, where we're pulling the data from. So the columns are going to stay the same. So what we did is we used so-called one-time binding, or bind once, to tell Angular, like, okay, render this use this data, render the HTML code accordingly, and there's no need anymore to watch for the data changes, because we know that the data is not going to change. And of course, you can say it another way, we don't care if data is going to change, so please don't attach watchers, don't spend any more CPU cycles. And that's how we did it with the header here. And the way you define bind once or one-time binding is by putting this double column in front of the data source, data table point columns in this particular case. By the way, bind once used to be a separate directive which was created by some user. He put it up on GitHub. Everybody started using it, and then eventually they pulled it in Angular 1.3, I believe. And it was a major improvement in the framework, really. It really meant a lot. So the bottom line for this slide, and for the ngrepeat, and generally, one more thing I failed to mention. One-time binding can be used everywhere, not only for ngrepeat. But here it's pretty useful, and you can put it anywhere you want in the HTML. So always think about whether your data is going to be changing. If it's not going to be changing, no need to put to put watchers to it. So actually, you do need to put one-time binding to turn it off. Okay, moving on to interpolation. So you're probably familiar with interpolation. You have them you have it in templating engines in PHP, like in Blade, in Laravel, and here it works pretty much the same. But one interesting thing is in Angular, where interpolation is also used widely. If you start off as you're just starting with Angular, you still don't know too many things, and you're looking at examples online, you're always going to be seeing interpolation everywhere. And again, if you're building just a small application, it really doesn't matter. You don't think about performance and interpolation and how they're connected. But if you start building large-scale applications, then you need to think about this as well, because it turns out that there is another way to achieve the same result as with interpolation by using ngbind directive. In this particular case, it's ngbind dash HTML, and another form is ngbind dash template. And the only difference is that ngbind is faster. So that's the only difference. You're getting the same result. And of course, the syntax is just a little bit different because you're not using the braces, of course. But anyway, this is something which is not mentioned that much, but it's a great difference, especially if you're building, again, large-scale application, because that's where it matters. If you're just building a small application, you're fine with either of these. Okay, a little bit about directives, but our own Truedash directives, TU directives. So in Truedash, we decided to go for this component-like approach, so to speak. So we like to build everything around directives as much as possible. And I'm saying this because you don't need to use directives almost at all. You can just rely on controllers and use ng-includes, so-called. However, we found directives to be much more useful because they promote reusability and isolation. And it just kind of feels the right way because you feel where the part of the application is starting and where it's ending. It's like a module. And that's why we like to use them. So for example, in this slide here, whole card builder, the whole screen, it's a single directive. And this upper left part where you have metrics, that's also a so-called metric selector directive. And visual styles is a directive, and chart is a directive, and menu is a directive, and it has 3 more nested directives inside, so a bunch of directives there. But we like that approach, sort of. I think this is very important to stick with, in our opinion, to stick with directives because Angular 2.0 is going to get rid of many concepts that exist in Angular 1.x. One of them is controller and scopes. All of these are going away. And Angular 2.0 won't be vertically compatible with Angular 1.x. And what they're going to be going forward with is an approach with web components. So everything is going to be a component. And directive is something, the closest you can get to components in Angular 1.x. And that's why we like to use directives, and we hope that it's going to be like easier transition for us to Angular 2.0 when it comes, because it's probably not going to be that straightforward because it's not vertically compatible. And yeah, one just small trivia, so to speak. In order to get any Angular application running, just to get a basic example, you always need to add ng-app on your starting tag. It can be an HTML tag or it can be a div tag. And it turns out actually that that's also a directive. So basically your whole application, whether you like it or not, is running inside of a single directive. And if you don't want to go with directives, that's pretty fine and pretty okay. But if you want to do anything, if you want to do any sort of DOM manipulation, that has to be done in a directive, whether you like it or not. Okay? And again, always have performance in mind. And I'm saying this because I'm somebody who comes from a world of multi-page applications. I'm not sure if that's the right word, the opposite of single-page applications, right? And when I was working on multi-page applications, I wasn't thinking about JavaScript performance. I didn't care too much. We didn't have too much JavaScript code. And then I knew if you just navigate away to other page, I knew that browser is just going to take care of it. It's going to collect all the unneeded space taken by my functions and variables. It's going to clean it up. And I don't care how it's working. I just know when I go to the next page, I have memory cleaned up. Well, in single-page application world, it doesn't work that way, of course. You need to think always about how you're dealing with memory. So you always, for example, need to have, if you're working with directives, you always need to think about this onDestroy event. And that one is triggered whenever a directive is being destroyed, and the same goes for controllers. So for example, in this particular case, if you're navigating away from the card builder, this onDestroy event gets triggered. And in this, when this event is triggered, you have a function. And yeah, one more thing before I go to that. So if you go to dashboard and to card builder and dashboard and card builder, and you do this 10 times, and if you haven't taken care of destroying of some of your jQuery libraries that you may have initialized here, you're going to end up with 10 instances or more of these libraries in your memory. And that's a serious performance issue. So you need to think about destroying all of these plugins that you can maybe initialized before leaving the screen. And this is something very important. And when I started off with this application, to be honest, I wasn't thinking about it. But then at some point I realized that it's important, so I started using it. Also, I would urge all Angular developers to use gulp or grunt. We are fans of gulp. So please minify your code, uglify it if you can, because it's a little bit tricky with Angular. We're still having some troubles there. do concatenation and do template caching. It's going to save you a lot of API or AJAX requests for fetching all of these. So it's going to save you a lot of time and lot of seconds on loading. Also, you need to have in mind this so-called debugger mode, which is something pretty interesting in Angular. Debugger mode is by default turned on. And what it's doing is it's attaching just regular plain classes to HTML elements. And when I saw that for the first time, I was thinking, okay, this probably is Angular is using it internally for something, right? It says ng-scope and ng-something else binding, so these are all classes. But actually it turned out that this is only used for other testing, for testing tools, for writing tests, and maybe for some other tools that you may be using while developing. So for example, you can install a Chrome extension called Batarang, and it's used for inspecting Angular application, and it attaches, it's an extension of Chrome, so it basically attaches to your DOM inspector, and you can inspect any of the values that are in Angular. So without these classes, Batarang wouldn't be able to work. So if you are when you move your application to production, of course, you're not going to be testing your application on production, I guess. So you need to turn off the debugger mode, and again you're going to feel this bump in performance. It's going to work faster because Angular is not going to be doing any DOM manipulation, which is pretty expensive. We probably all know that. And we're not going to be having all of these classes.
Sorry, 4 more minutes.
Okay, so yeah, we just touched on the tip of the iceberg here, a lot of other things that we need to think about, but the main thing is always think about performance, and you can have a great experience with working with Angular. So just a couple of links here. First of all, AngularJs link, their main website. Then Angular style guide written by John Papa, and later together with the community, the right way to write Angular. This is a strong recommendation. And if you like listening to podcasts, I like listening to them while I'm running or taking a walk, Adventures in Angular. They do it every week. A bunch of guys talking only about Angular. One of them is this guy, John. A lot of useful pieces of advice there. So strong, great for listening. Strong recommendation, yeah, that's what I want to say. And in the end, Angular.io, which is a new site for Angular 2.0, which is just in the process of development. If you want to go into Angular, you don't go with 2.0. It's still a very early phase of development, just for playing around. And it's going to be ready by the end of 2015. A little bit about Truedash team. These two guys here are in the audience. They are Bora and Nikola. Bora is our HTML coder and designer, and he was in charge of designing this presentation here. And Nikola is our front-end developer. I'm putting their pictures up so that you can talk to them after the presentation, ask the questions, any questions you might have. You can also talk to me. And of course, if you're interested in working with us, you can come talk to us, and you may be the next new member of Truedash. Thank you for your time.